What's up guys, Adam here again from Kinetics Physiotherapy. We've got another video. This time we're looking at hip impingement. So hip impingement, also known as femoroacetabular impingement or FAI for short, essentially refers to where your hip, the ball and socket joint around the pelvis here. So the ball and socket, essentially you've got your thigh bone, your femur that comes up towards the hip, and then you've got your pelvis which forms the socket, and it looks a bit like this around the pelvis. And essentially, if we were to x-ray that hip, if you have FAI or hip impingement, essentially there might be a bit of extra bone growth either on the cup of the socket or on the top of what's called the head of the femur, the top of the thigh bone there. And then those two bits, or you might have a bit of extra bone growth on both. And that can sort of cause catching and a pinching type feeling right in the groin often. And it can be really, really uncomfortable. What I'll do is, sort of rather than gesturing just like this, so you can get a better idea, I'll try and see if I can put a picture somewhere on the screen to give you a better idea. There's essentially three different types of hip impingement. There's what you call the cam deformity, which is essentially a bit of extra bone growth on the femur. You've got the pincer deformity, which is a bit more bone growth on the cup, on in the hip, on the pelvis there, which can cause that catching. And then you've got the combined, which is essentially a bit of both, where you've got a bit of extra bone growth on the femur, and you've got a bit of extra bone growth in the pelvis, and those two bits of bone can catch together and pinch together, and it can be quite uncomfortable. And you often find that it's quite uncomfortable. Most people that get it are early adults. Usually they're quite active, especially when they're growing up. Unfortunately, if you do a lot of multi-directional sports when you're a teenager or when you're a kid growing up, it can increase your chances of developing it. And in later life, and it often comes out when you're sort of in your mid to late 20s, 30s, and if you're still active. That's when you generally find that it's quite sore. So things to avoid doing when you have FAI or you suspect that you have FAI is looking at excessive hip flexion, which is essentially bringing that knee up towards the chest. Because if I sit sideways, we're looking at the angle around here, and if I bring my knee up towards my chest, this angle gets smaller, and that's called hip flexion. Whether I have the knee straight or not is irrelevant. I can't have the knee straight because my hamstrings aren't sort of flexible enough, but essentially the further the knee is up towards the chest, the smaller this angle here. If I lean back, it would increase the angle, but that causes those two bits of bone to potentially pinch together. So if it's an irritated hip impingement or FAI, it just further irritates it. So you often find stuff like deep squatting is quite uncomfortable, deep lunging as well. Sometimes people argue that box jumps, can be quite irritating for it, but that's only if they're high. So essentially you're landing in a deep squat position, that can be quite sore, and we're just trying to avoid that. The only other thing that's sort of non-weight bearing that can be sore is looking at like a straight leg raise exercise where you're laying down and lifting the leg up, just because you can go through and you can feel this sort of catching and clicking type sensation, which is those two bones catching, which again isn't particularly comfortable usually, especially if it's irritated. So if you think that you have hip impingement or FAI, definitely go and speak to the GP, doctor or a physiotherapist to make sure that they can assess you and make sure that is the problem that's going on, and then they can go through some exercises with you, some of which we'll look at today. As always with all these videos, go and see somebody before you start doing any exercises. Go and see a physio, go and see your GP or doctor, just to make sure that everything's okay and you're safe to do these exercises and it's not going to aggravate it further. So we're going to look at 3 or 4 exercises today that can really help with hip impingement. So when we're looking at hip impingement, we're looking at mostly the muscles in the abdominal muscles and also sort of around the hip as well to support that area. And always sometimes you can change the position so those bones don't catch as much with strengthening exercises. So all of them will involve laying down. So I lay on my back here. So the first one that we'll look at is a pelvic tilt, which I have covered in a couple of previous videos, but we'll look at it again today. Essentially what you want to do is imagine you're trying to squash your lower back against the bed here, or the floor in my case. So what you want to do is have your knees bent, feet flat on the floor, roughly sort of shoulder width apart, and then you can put your hands underneath here if you want to for a bit of guidance to start with, but it's not essential. But essentially there's usually a bit of a gap underneath the lower back here, And what I want you to try and do is squash that lower back there and really push it into the bed. And if you watch me do it, I'll do it again. And this time I want you to watch my pelvis here. You should see it start to lift. So if I squash my hands here, you get that lift of the pelvis here. Not an enormous lift, but it's tilting the pelvis as we engage those abdominal muscles. And you can try it without the hands, and you can have the hands by your side. I'll put them across my chest so you can see what's going on. But essentially you want to squash the lower back, the pelvis will tilt. Hold that for a second and then come back. That's the first, most basic exercise to help. And it should be pretty pain-free. And for a lot of people, quite straightforward. So if you want to progress that a bit further, you can have your hands across your chest, squash that lower back into the bed, keep that pressure on, and then lift. Imagine you're lifting up towards the ceiling rather than a crunch. So we're going to squash the lower back here and then lift up towards the ceiling and back down again. Just the shoulder blades, you don't have to go far. Just squash the lower back and lift the shoulder blades up and back down again. Okay. That's sort of exercise number one. Number two, again, I've covered in a previous video, we're going to look at a bridge. So it's a very similar starting position, feet shoulder width apart, knees bent and your feet flat on the bed or on the floor. You're going to go into that pelvic tilt to start with, so you're going to squash that lower back, and that pelvis starts to lift, and you essentially follow it through, lifting off the bed or the floor, vertebra by vertebra. Make sure you don't overextend, we don't want to be in this position, just coming up so that there's a straight line from your shoulders all the way down to your knees. Hold that position, and then roll back down vertebra by vertebra. Okay, and then come back up, so squash the pelvis, squash the lower back, sorry, to tilt the pelvis, follow it through, lifting up, hold at the top, and then come back down. And then squash the lower back, lift the pelvis up, peel the lower back off the bed, up into this top position here, make sure that the abs are engaged throughout. And then slowly lower yourself down, again vertebra by vertebra, down to the floor. Now for some people this might be quite straightforward, so to make it a bit more challenging, what you can always do is work on a single leg bridge. So you can either do a single leg from the start, so start with one leg straight and then lift up. If that's a bit too challenging, there's an intermediate, which have your feet on the floor, squash the lower back into that pelvic tilt, follow it through, come to the top, hold that position, try and keep your pelvis level, straighten one leg, and then come back down. Keep the pelvis level, keep the hips up as well, straighten the other leg, and come back down. And if you want to challenge yourself, you can hold this position and just alternate from one leg to another. And then try and do sort of 4 or 5 on each side, and then come back down. So that's exercise number 2, looking at a bridge and progressing the bridge as well. So the other 2 exercises involve laying on your side. So if I was looking at my left hip, I'd be laying on my right hand side. So the leg to be worked is going to go on top. And essentially what you want to do, have the bottom knee bent just for a bit of support, and you're going to have your left, or the bad leg, the leg you're going to work on top. Roll your hips forwards. You want to imagine there's a pole going through your hips, and so they're one on top of each other. You're stacking them on top of each other. You shouldn't be leaning back, which is what a lot of people do. Make sure you're leaning forwards, and then what I want you to do is keep your feet together. They're going to stay there, and then you're just going to lift the knee off the other leg just slightly. You see there's not an enormous gap here, maybe 2 or 3 inches, and then come back down again. Make sure those hips stay rolling forward, because that really engages the muscles around the outside of the hip. So just going, pausing, and then come back down. Lifting up, pausing, and come back down. This is a clam exercise, or clamshell sometimes it's called. And again, if you want to make this more challenging, grab one of those exercise bands. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to sort of purchase one that I've used in a previous video. But just tie it in a loop, put it around the knees. It just gives a bit of resistance there. There we go. So that's exercise number 3. And then number 4, again, you're going to be in this sideline position, bottom leg bent. Top leg this time is going to be straight. And what you're going to do, keep those hips rolled forwards, Keep that top leg straight, lift it up towards the ceiling. Again, you don't have to go all the way up, just go until, so if you're just past that horizontal, you feel these muscles engaging on the outside of the hip. Pause and come back down. And up again. Pause and come back down. And if this is quite straightforward for you and you want to make it a bit more challenging, then either you could do one of two things. Number one is rotate the leg so that you're leading with the heel. Again, keep those hips rolled forwards. Leading with the heel just makes it that bit more challenging. Or what you can do is, if you really want to challenge yourself, keep the hips rolled forwards, but bring the leg back. Then lift it up and down back here. This one's a bit more challenging, mainly from a technique point of view, because what it's very tempted to do is to roll the hips back with it. You've really got to fight it to keep them forwards. But just bring the leg back like so. And again, just lifting up, pause, come back down. Lifting up, pause, and come back down. So all of these exercises, so all 4 of them, you should be looking at doing between 8 and 12 repetitions. Have a breather, have a rest, and then try and do that between 2 and 3 times. And try and do that every other day. Just have a nice rest day in between, especially to start with. If things are quite sore around the hips, even that number of repetitions, just see what you can manage. It's not worth pushing through any significant pain. These exercises should not be painful, any of them. At most, they might be a bit uncomfortable, but they shouldn't be painful. You should be gritting your teeth to push through them. And if they are, stop and seek some advice, okay? So that sort of concludes the video for the exercises for hip impingement. If you have any questions, or you want to ask me anything, or if there's anything you want me to cover in a future video, please leave it in the comments below and I'll get back to you and I can make it into a future video. And if you find some value in this, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps with building up that base of people that I can spread the word to, and if they can reach some people that can help themselves, then that's going to really be beneficial for them. So thank you for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next video.